Welcome to ALN Academy's first webinar of the year. So congratulations for making it over here. Today we are not only honored to be joined by esteemed guests, but also to be discussing a very pertinent issue that I'm hoping all of you are going to have some insights on that we can take forward. So today, we are reaching for peace on a multi-sectoral approach to the DRC crisis and its implications for trade, security, as well as diplomacy. Joining me today are very wonderful guests. Online, we have Dr. Michael Nkwapa. He is an associate fellow with the Royal Services Institute, a founding director of the Research Center for African Conflict and Development, based in the UK, which is why he couldn't be here with us. So if anyone wants to fly him down next time, please do. We will also be joined by Dr. Chido Mtangadura, who is here with us. Dr. Chido is a senior fellow with the United Nations University with experience in African policy issues. Her work emphasizes the importance of collaboration and dialogue in preventing and resolving conflicts, making a very valuable guest for us. Welcome, Dr. Chido. You may come up. The next panelist that we have is somebody very, very interesting, but aren't they all? It is Bram Reles, who is with the Institute for Security Studies, here on an EU project that is focusing on the DRC, and he is joining us all the way from Belgium and has a flight to catch right after this. This is how important he thought this was. So thanks, Bram. The next person that we have, who I stalked to death until I found online, is Louise Khabure, who is a highly skilled and accomplished consultant with a deep expertise in conflict management, security, and political crisis, particularly in the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes region, and East Africa. So welcome, Louise. And finally, someone very, very excited and, making me feel like I have a lot of clout, is Ambassador Jean Kimani, who is a distinguished career diplomat with over 40 years of experience in international relations, diplomacy, and peace building. As Kenya's High Commissioner to Botswana and permanent representative to the United Nations Habitat, she championed global urbanization, housing, and climate resilience efforts. Her expertise in negotiating bilateral agreements has strengthened trade, investment, and diaspora relations, while her leadership in platforms such as IGAD and the Great Lakes Conference has reinforced Kenya's commitment to regional stability and economic cooperation. So don't you think you are lucky to come today? So welcome, Ambassador. And I'll leave this off for you to begin our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rutendo. And good afternoon. Good afternoon, participants. Good afternoon, my guest speakers here. Such a pleasure to have you here with us today. And of course, you've heard what we have in store for you. And we hope that at the end of it, you'll be able to answer us. You'll be able to ask a number of questions, having been satisfied with what the speakers will have said. So to get into the matter, I think, as you have been told, we are discussing the DRC, the implications for peace, all right? But maybe as we start off, I think just to start us off, I think you're all aware of what has been going on in the DRC, and more particularly in Goma, the crisis in Goma, where I think on January 24th and 25th, the war started there, the conflict started, or it escalated as it has been there. And what we've been having now is that the M23, as of now, have invaded or are in control of Goma and a number of towns in Eastern DRC. It has created a humanitarian disaster in itself because there have been quite a number of people who have been displaced. there are, of course, a lot of, it is a humanitarian crisis. It is also a security crisis because I think where there is conflict, you know, between the government of the day there and the military forces for M23 because they have already taken that area. So it's quite a conflict. But to go back to the issue of DRC itself, I think you're versed in the history of DRC, that since its inception, we've had, you know, it got its independence in 1960. And since then, of course, there have been a number of conflicts that are regional in nature, become regional in nature, and of course, security instability, which has led to instability in the region and in the country. So I want to start us off, just to ask us a few questions as we start off, right? How can multilateralism, I just want to first introduce the panelists here again, and as we do, we can just discuss how can multilateralism, what do you think, has multilateralism failed? Has the UN, has these international organizations that we have failed the DRC, right? And perhaps what lessons are there to learn in the situation that is unfolding right now? What could have been done better? We have seen that we had an East African standby force there. We have had SADC forces there as well. We have had the region, the bigger region, come up on peace processes in the DRC, but there seems to have what do we need to learn from that? So I want us to, let's go around on that as we start our discussion. Thank you. I don't know who will go first. Left to right.
Hello, can you hear me? I think since I'm on this end, I think just to make a quick comment about sort of where we are in terms of multilateralism. And I think quite often, you know, there is quite valid criticism of especially regional governance on the continent. I mean, people would say to you the AU is a club of dictators and so on and so forth, or the EAC is weak, or but I do feel that it's also important for us to situate ourselves in the context in which regional governance works on the continent, how these structures actually function. And when you look at, you need to understand that the EAC or SADC or AU, they don't work like the European Union does. And so when states join these organizations, they don't actually sort of cede a part of their sovereignty. And these functions really are, these regional structures really are interstate structures. And so they work on consensus. And so where we are in then trying to solve, you know, the DRC issue is that these regional organizations cannot force any of the parties to do what they don't want to do. I mean, REX and the AU have been very reluctant to use forceful diplomacy, so that's something that, you know, they sort of try to stay away from. They try to seek consensus, and so when a conflict is this complicated, I think those are sort of the way that they function are also already weaken them. And then alongside this is sort of the broader retreat in global governance, in more and more, you know, in more and more like states, you know, like in the global north, for example, you know, beginning to sort of undermine global governance structures. And that also then trickles down to how regional governance is going to work on the continent. It weakens it. So I think that's important to note as we sort of go on to understand why people aren't seeing the very strong, you know, strong statements coming out against Rwanda, why we're not seeing sort of threat of sanctions or threats of force against the parties.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this. I think if we look at more broadly, I think the question if multilateralism failed, I think it is yes and no. because on the one hand, if we look at other conflicts on the globe today, Russia, Ukraine, we look at Israel, Gaza, in contrast to those large regional conflicts as well, this one has been, the efforts have been very much driven by multilateral organizations. And indeed with their challenges, and the regional peace process has not been able to avoid the escalation we have seen now. But at the same time, we have to observe that also that this is very much a process driven by multilateral organizations. So, but there are also weaknesses. Also looking at the African Union, I think, which has failed to bring, or has struggled at least, to bring, harmonize these various processes, because there are these different approaches, which I will get back to later. But also United Nations, where it has taken a very long time to bring out a resolution on this conflict, and but it has come out. So there's also a positive side to, if you look at other conflicts where we see constant vetoing of United States or Russia or China, there was a resolution passed which was unanimous on this conflict. So this also, I think we have to also underline that. I think one of the often unsaid factors that have hindered the success of regional efforts is that this conflict has many layers, and it's not only a inter-Congolese conflict, it is also an interstate conflict, or it has interstate dimensions. And so especially in the East African community, we have seen the community struggling in the past to address regional tensions, whether they were between Rwanda and Burundi in the context of the political crisis 2015, or between Rwanda and Uganda more recently. So I think this is also a factor that kind of hampers multilateral responses.
Thank you for that. Yes, do you like to say something?
I'll just add something. I think we shouldn't feel bogged down by this issue, because it's a global problem. I mean, for instance, we've had Britain leave the EU. We had Brexit, you know. We had Britain leave the EU. We've had Brexit. So there are a lot of teething problems when it comes to multilateralism that are just general and happen across these groupings because of just disparities and dynamics, whether it's cultural dynamics, language barriers, issues of trust, political will. I mean, if you look at even the formation of the East African community, it took a while. Tanzania is very uncomfortable with Kenya, for example, because of the history, that socialist history. Tanzania has a socialist background, Kenya is capitalistic, and Tanzanians are not comfortable with Kenyans. Ugandans feel it's a landlocked country, they're dealing with different issues there, they are more comfortable with Tanzania. So you just have just basic challenges that arise from the fact of the specific differences unique to each country and how that is managed. Another crisis is also that many of these, sadly, as Africa, many of these groupings are also not necessarily funded by us. Some of the funding mechanisms are external. So you have a lot of countries that haven't even paid their own subsidies, that haven't paid their stipends. So we have funding challenges as well. And then you also have dominant countries. For instance, Kenya is a very strong country versus, Rwanda is a smaller country. So there are all these little that affect just the that now trickles down to the conflict, and the conflict is in DRC. They are when you go to
Thank you indeed for that. I think as we look at the DRC, I think as we've explained, some of the challenges that it faces is because one from, if you recall the war, the genocide in Rwanda, we had, a number of people flee from that, right? They fled from that, the genocide, and went into Eastern DRC. And of course, for the country that I think Rwanda always says that their people, those who fled are a danger to them, right? So for them, it is important to make sure that they have some control over those people that fled there. But that is how many years ago, and it's about 30 years ago since they fled, and they must have, they must be a new generation that not the old. So we have tensions based on not on multilateral, but region country dynamics, right? Based on the historic processes within countries. So there we are. I think that question has been widely responded to. We are just started giving you a glimpse of what multilateralism could do. Maybe on another note, I could ask, right? What do you feel that this region of the East African Community, the AU, right, SADC, what could they do better, right? Because we've had, as I said earlier, we've had the East African Standby Force, we have had SADC as a peacekeeping, we've had MONUSCO there. MONUSCO has been there for about 8 years, no, more than 8 years, and I think their term was to end in December last year, but it was renewed. So what needs to, based on the weaknesses that we have seen, how can we strengthen the peace building mechanisms, right? That these organizations are able to do. My network. Thank you. I think one of the things that should be addressed is we've had that in this conflict that some individuals have been issued sanctions. And I think some of these, the EAC, the AU, their leader, their more gravitas, they prefer to move into post-conflict posture. Although I do think in this particular conflict that the sanctions are good and are good, a step in the right direction. But there are sanctions towards individuals. I don't know whether there should be sanctions towards countries, but enforcing sanctions is a big something that needs to be done, so that the sanctions are implemented. And then you also have this issue. You had this Frank Dodd Act that basically deals with the issue around conflict minerals and showing where they originated from and things like that. So I'm not sure where we are at in terms of reporting and doing due diligence on this act. So I guess some of these regional organizations could also do more in terms of following up on the reporting and on following up on the due diligence of some of this legislation and some of the issues under the Frank Dodd Act. Thank you. Thank you. Perhaps I can invite our speakers online, Dr. Michael Nwampa, to you can contribute to this particular discussion. We are just starting off before we get to you. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. I was going to add to the problematic of multilateralism. There seems to be an echo coming back to me.
If you can.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, brilliant. So I was going to say, over the years, maybe perhaps in the last decade,
Sorry, we can't hear you. What's happening?
can you hear me?
Is it the microphone? Is it the microphone?
Sorry for that, Mike. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to stay a bit more in the immediate when you ask this question, because I think what we are seeing unfolding currently in Eastern DRC, specifically in North and South Kivu, is unprecedented. And I think this needs to be stressed, that we are seeing, and of course we all, and I think we'll talk about that later, we all know that the Congolese state has its weaknesses, but we're witnessing a retreat of the Congolese state that we haven't seen in a number of decades. And we also see an escalation in the conflict dynamics themselves, where before conflict was mostly located in rural areas. We have seen the taking over of key cities. We are seeing a humanitarian situation which is really unprecedented. And yesterday yesterday I had a chance to talk with some humanitarian actors, and they also feel that there is a really big disconnect between their efforts on the terrain, what they're witnessing, and these regional efforts. So, for example, I think that there is a kind of lack of sense of urgency that has come from some of these summits. An example has been the first summit in Dar es Salaam, which gave the commanders of the defense forces 5 days to come up with some propositions, and then 30 days for ministers to validate them. And that was about a ceasefire. And I was very surprised to see that. And that was really kind of, for me, kind of symbol of, I think there needs to be more sense of urgency about the situation. And that also, I think, means including and providing pathways for actors on the terrain as humanitarian actors, or peacekeeping forces, civil society, to have a voice in this, and to also bring these, what is unfolding, to bring this into this process.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you've mentioned a very, very important point there. The need for urgency. There is the need for urgency to deal with the situation as it is, right? And of course, that can only be at the multilateral level as well. M23 and all the parties can only be brought together if there's a sense of urgency within the region that, and within the international community, that indeed we need to deal with this. This has to stop. So thank you for that. I think going forward, this is something that we need, that actually speaks to the question that we are talking about. Yes, please go. Yes, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to respond to that briefly, is that there is a question of talks, of course. There's a question of that's very important, but there is also very immediate humanitarian needs that need to be addressed. There is the question of access to essential services. It has been mentioned also earlier in a prior session, the circulation of arms, where we see really insecurity increase very worryingly in certain areas. And so there is a question of the opening of humanitarian corridors of the airport, in order to coordinate and to have access to ensure humanitarian access. That is the key. I think that's a key priority that needs to be pushed forward, and of course dialogue as well. But I also want to stress these immediate needs.
Thank you for that. Would you like to go forward?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I would say when you look at where we are today with the crisis, I think this was something that was sort of reasonably easy to predict in December when the Rwandan delegation pulled out of the Luanda process. I think at that point, and there was a very weak response, I think internationally, I mean, regionally, I don't remember if there was any, statement that was put out on that. So I think that definitely emboldened M23, that definitely emboldened Rwanda. And I think at the moment, as he's saying about the lack of agency, I think a part of it is also the lack of consensus between, the states in the regions themselves. Something that we mentioned in the morning is that an influential dynamics into how DRC is being handled by the different, regional structures is tensions between member states within the regional organization. So tensions between member states in the EAC, but also tensions between the EAC and SADC. And I think what is sort of needed going forward, I think, is quite a bit of back channeling, which I think is something that Kenyatta and Angola's president should have been doing, seeking consensus between the member states to actually have, a unified stance on going forward, because I think there's been quite a bit of time that has been wasted, and I think waiting for the forums to then start discussing and then arguing and then kicking out the AUC chairman, and I think that sort of is a clear indication that sort of back channel diplomacy is not being or is not being effectively utilized. And I think this also has allowed foreign shopping by Rwanda and DRC, because they understand that they can, in a way leverage those tensions, in order to sort of push their own political interests in this. And I think so that would be for me, one thing that I would say, that I think we do need a very concentrated back channeling effort to get member states in the EAC and SADC to at least have a unified, stance.
Thank you for that. We can try Michael again. Thank you.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Brilliant. I was going to add to that. I was happy yesterday to see the UK government coming up with a very strong position, and also the US and some of these positions. But I agree with Bram that there's been some kind of slow response, which reflects some kind of lack of urgency. But I think that also reflects what we've been seeing with the problematics with multilateral response or multilateralism in terms of global governance. So we've been seeing in the past decades the shift towards a new world order, whereas at the end of the Cold War, we saw a clear leader, American hegemon. So what we have now, we don't even have a multipolar world. We just have a non-polar world. We have where we're seeing alliances, new alliances being formed. We've seen expansions of other alliances, whether it be BRICS, whether it be NATO. So all of this have kind of left a vacuum in global governance, where we can't see that swift response when we have crisis in all these other places. But then again, what we've also seen, which is very unfortunate, is a lack of moral authority. So we're seeing with the US, we see some kind of receding of democracy, democratic values. So we're seeing the rise of authoritarianism, not even in much less developed democracies. We're seeing it in even developed democracies in America and other places. So we're also seeing uneven responses. We see the case of Ukraine. We see the case of neglected conflict in Sudan. So all of this is creating some sort of emboldening authoritarian governments, authoritarian or creating that space where people can just intervene. What was happening in DRC. So I think this has created an issue. We're seeing again a new scramble for Africa, whereas the conflict in Congo, we can't divorce it from the external impact. We sometimes focus on the regions, focus on the countries, but also not taking account of external partners such as China, so that they scramble for new minerals outside of that region. So I think we need to look at all of these intersecting elements if we are to carve out or design a response to it. All of this we need to be, we need to be addressed.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. And we are hearing you loud and clear. So perhaps as we go forward, I'm still asking just some general questions. And I want to still go to you to start to continue with you on the security and economic trade-offs. We have seen that, DRC is, would be called an economic powerhouse if it was at its best, because of it has a wealth of minerals that are very important to investors, and it is a rich country, and of course the population, it has a population of more than 100 million people. So when you look at the security challenges that are there, how do you feel what do you think of it in terms of its economy right now, and the economic development for the region? Because I think the crisis as we have it right now has an impact on its economic development. What are your views on this? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. So my take, I will start from what is going on in the negotiation between Trump and Ukraine, and where we've seen some kind of like blatant demand for the mineral resources of Ukraine in exchange for security guarantees or provision of military support. So I've always maintained that it is naive to assume that interventions are altruistic. There's no intervention that is altruistic. It is always self-interest. Everyone has a strategic interest. And in my research, in my study, I've always asked for some sort of balance, reconciling that strategic interest with human rights. So over the years, when we see Western intervention in Africa, for instance, is always couched in terms of human rights conditions. But underlying all of that is actually a quest for an extractive is an extractive process, is to get the resources. So why not say clearly, this is what we want. We want the resources, and then if someone mentioned agency earlier on, and the Africans also has an agency and say, okay, we have these resources. You want these resources. This is what we want, and they can leverage on that power. I did interview one of the ministers in DRC, and she said clearly about how the DRC government more like prefers China, or has that leverage to deal with either China or the West. So I think moving forward, it will be a question of trade-off. It will be a question of, this is not aid. We don't want aid. We don't want some disguise of aid, or creating conflict or chaos to be able to legally then extract resources. Why not do it in a formal way, an official way, and say, this is what we want. We need to negotiate and have some kind of a transparency in terms of the relationship in terms of trade. So I think moving forward, there'll be a lot of transparency. There'll be a lot of negotiation, and Africa is right to also deal with multiple actors in this, whether it be China, whether it be some of these middle powers that are rising. That gives it more leverage to be able to negotiate its resources and then guarantee the development or economic prosperity of its people.
Thank you. We have Idil also on the line. Oh, thank you. She's not on the line, eh? Oh, okay, she's dropped. Oh, she'll be there at one time. Thank you for that. But just to add on to that, I think on the just to discuss the security challenges on the cross-border economic situation, I think perhaps there is a challenge there for the region, because we are not able to work on we have the agreement by the Great Lakes on illicit, the use of illicit, the trade on illegal exploitation of minerals. That is, there is a pact on the illegal exploitation of minerals. But as it is now, I think you'll find that there's a lot of smuggling between, in that region, because there are no clear parts of trade for minerals to pass through. So everybody, the artisan miners can find their minerals going to different countries and vice versa. So I think perhaps we need to go back to respecting, go back to ensuring that there is security in that particular area if we are to protect the economic benefits of the region. So lastly, I think we can discuss just a bit on the humanitarian and gender perspective. We had started discussing it a little, but indeed, as our colleague had said earlier, there is a challenge, there is a humanitarian crisis that is taking place because of the conflict in the eastern part of DRC. Any comments on it? Anybody wants to comment on it? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. And while doing that, I also want to add to what Michael has been saying on the global level, because if you look at the humanitarian funding for the DRC, 70% of that funding comes from United States funding, and the United States has just suspended its USAID programs. So there is this has really a huge impact on the humanitarian response in the DRC. With them expecting that they will only be able to fulfill, in the best case scenario, 30% of the humanitarian response needs for next year. And this in a situation where the humanitarian situation itself is only deteriorating. At the same time, I also want to add that we can talk about strategic interests, but I think we also have to talk about disinterest. And strategic interests, they are there. But with regards to this conflict, I think most of what I have observed has been more about disinterest. And this is a trend that Michael, I think, rightly observes, that we're going to a more like realist world where there's more transactional and more about these kind of hard interests. And the more this conflict would expand, this more this becomes a scenario that is possible. But until now, for example, the Trump administration, do they have an Africa policy? Will they have one? I don't think their priority is in Africa at all at the moment, but this might change. But at the moment, I don't really see that. One thing to add on the humanitarian is that we also have to acknowledge that the humanitarian situation in the DRC has been deteriorating for the past years. And so prior to the resurgence of the M23 crisis, this was already the case. And so if we look at conflict-induced displacement, this has been increasing for years now. In also not only in North Kivu as an impulse of the M23 crisis, but also in other areas in the east. And so this is something that is exacerbated by the current crisis with M23, but also part of a broader trend, which is also, I think, an important thing to mention, that there are several other armed groups in Eastern DRC. And so the security issues are not only linked to M23, but M23 crisis itself exacerbates and leads to security and humanitarian gaps in other areas as well. We're observing this in South Kivu province, for example, and in Ituri, where M23 is not present yet, but where we're seeing a rapid deterioration of the situation as an other impulse of what is happening in North and South Kivu with M23.
Thank you. Thank you. Is it on the line? Perhaps. Yes, I would like to perhaps ask her, how can gender perspectives be integrated into peace processes? Perhaps she or? Okay. Okay, maybe you can have the questions online.
Yes. Okay, so the first question is to Dr. Chido. How do you see the relationship between human security and traditional state-centric security approaches evolving in the African peace processes? The second question is, and is open to the floor, is it not possible that for the AU to assign one regional economic body, given how many actors are involved in the DRC crisis, including the regional economic bodies? And lastly, there are a number of participants or interests, Americans, Belgians, British, Chinese, etc. Is Rwanda not just a scapegoat in what is happening? DRC, for Dr. Chido, how do you see the relationship between human security and traditional state-centric security approaches evolving in African peace processes? The other questions, should I repeat? Sure.
Okay, thank you very much. I think for me, there's a very close link. And I take it back to the work that I've done on security sector reform and the understanding that the traditional sort of state-centric security, it's not quite working well for the continent. One of the reasons being that because of the evolution of what we call security threats, right? And so when you look at things like climate security, you sort of start to see how that state-centric sort of security approaches not really being able to address the needs that we face today, but at the same time, also looking at the fact that African sort of security actors are actually not as effective. So they're not effective even in that traditional state-centric work, and more so with the evolving challenges. And I mean, DRC for me is a very good example of this. How many security actors are in DRC? How big is DRC's own military? And yet we've seen that militias, sort of militia groups have managed to overwhelm their army. But beyond that is that you see that in DRC, this sort of privatization of security where the state itself allows armed groups who are not under its purview, become sort of the main security actors, sort of take away that monopoly of force that the state ought to have. So I think in looking at where we are today, as we go forward to address, and this is not just for DRC, other African states, to address contemporary human security needs is one, reforming our security structures in a way that, we evolve, like we sort of enhance their capacity, but also their function to just go beyond, sort of being these, I think the sort of use of force, the way that they do it, because a lot of it is not, for example, doesn't comply with human rights mechanisms. Somebody would say, for example, our security forces are so much better when they are shooting at civilians than they ever will be when it actually comes to actual military threats. So that is it. I think number one is how they work, enhancing their capacity, and also our understanding of what security is. Because as we see, even with DRC, a lot of the threats are actually, we're seeing more regional conflict systems emerging. So it's not just about the one country being able to secure itself, but then what more of the crisis that happens in, neighboring states. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that question has been well responded to, but there is a second part to it about is it possible for AU to design one body for the DRC, and also that Rwanda is a scapegoat in this and the other players. I think for this, I would say that indeed there are other players, but it has also been documented. I think just even before this crisis of 2025 erupted, There is a UN experts report that was presented to the UN Security Council in 2024, and previous reports have highlighted the role of Rwanda in the conflict, but that does not mean that there are no other players in the conflict, right? So this is definitely there are other players, but that has been documented, and of course, also on the other hand, there are players supporting the government, as has also been documented that the Burundi forces were there for the government, but of course, of course, they were overpowered. Or South Africa, there were other or those that had been hired, to protect the interests of government. But at the same time, Rwanda has been mentioned in that by the UN report and many other reports. So we're just here to say what is there out there. Now, on the issue of is it possible for the AU to designate one organization? I think, normally in this kind of thing, there's a multi-organizational approach, including the UN. I think even the Congolese foreign minister was at the UN Security Council the other day to discuss the issue of the crisis, right? So it has to be a multi-pronged approach. But at the same time, the regional approach, right? AU leaves the regions concerned, DRC is a member of both the SADC and East African Community. So both they can take their approach, but it depends. You cannot resolve an issue that with a government, or for a government, a legitimate government, without its consent, right? You cannot enter into a territory, according to the AU Charter, right? Interventions have to also, within the AU Charter, you cannot just enter a territory. So it has to be within accepted international laws, right? So I hope the question has been answered, but my colleagues, please feel free.
But I think it's an interesting perspective because Eastern Congo has had a long-standing problem, long-standing conflict with very clear players, its neighbors, Rwanda, the top of the list, Uganda, Burundi. And so it might be an interesting way to address it, to form a specific commission, although commissions have a bad reputation, but a specific commission that looks specifically on the Eastern Congo and its unique challenges and its unique problems. So I think it's for me, I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, and it could be one specialized way of looking at the crisis in the East. And you can address whether it's humanitarian issues, political issues, military issues. Of course, MONUSCO has a mandate for Congo, but the MONUSCO mandate is to support FARDC and to record human rights violations. But I do think this idea of a special commission just to look at the East specifically might be an interesting perspective, and that should be equipped with the right staff and also with somebody senior enough at the top who can enforce some of the things that need to be enforced in terms of peace agreements.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just want to add to that when you talk about or regional organizations to address this, they actually exist, and like one example is the International Conference for the Great Lakes region, which was created actually after the previous Second Congo War, and also in which you also were national coordinator. And so and which also in the previous M23 crisis in 2012-2013, the ICGLR was instrumental in the resolution of this conflict. And that was under impulse of the then Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, who was playing a leading role in this. So, but that also brings us to the question of capacity building and the funding issue and the internal politics. And it's also, we have other frameworks as the Addis Abeba Accord Cadre, the PSC framework that has been created. These instruments have not been used to their full capacity. And in some way, they're also, I think, bypassed and have been somewhat weakened by these EAC SADC efforts. And who knows, maybe they will eventually land back to the ICGLR. And one of those initial indicators for that is that they're already talking about strengthening one of its organs, the expanded verification mechanism that is now has not been politically validated, but maybe they will eventually land back, and then the ICGLR can play a more prominent role. And on the question of the scapegoating of Rwanda, I think the answer is yes and no to that, because it depends what is meant by that. I think we have to acknowledge that actually since 2022 already, the United Nations Group of Experts has documented this role of Rwanda. It should not be a taboo. And but there is a conspiracy theories around this, that Rwanda is just a front for foreign interests, Western interests, this Balkanization theory that exists. And I think those have to be addressed, because those are not necessarily true. And we also see a trend in the DRC, where the Congolese government is blaming a lot of its ills to Rwanda, beyond the observable, what we're all seeing. But we're seeing Rwanda accused of infiltration in all kinds of aspects. Other security problems have been blamed to Rwanda. So yes, there is a form of scapegoating of Rwanda, but it should be clarified where on which part.
Thank you for that. And actually, as you said, I was one of those who were in the negotiations for the first M23 negotiations with the government of Rwanda in 2011, 2012, when the conflict between M23 and the government of Rwanda, government of DRC erupted at the time, still in the same place, still in the Goma, around Goma. And yes, there was an agreement that was signed. And there were negotiations. I think member states of the Great Lakes, I think we sat for many nights negotiating with all the parties to the conflict. And there was an agreement that they were not, in fact, the agreement was for them to be gotten into government as well, right? Their people to get into government as well. And then there was a way to make sure that nobody felt excluded, right? But unfortunately, I think as we are seeing now, this has unfolded again. So perhaps we need, I like the idea of capacity building, the idea of strengthening the role of some of the regional organizations that maybe are not playing a part, including the ICGLR, as currently is. Then the issue of indeed there is the pact on the trading on natural resources. And that, of course, is under the ICGLR and was signed by member states. But the impact of it, I think, the mechanism, the transparency mechanism of seeing where they are coming from, the trade, right, has not been enacted so far. So this needs to be done, and capacity building, most importantly. Thank you for that question. Those questions. Perhaps we can move on. Are there any more? One more? Yes, let's have one more.
So the question is, given the multiple collapses of peace agreements and peace processes, what exactly is going wrong, and who exactly should be handling the responsibility of capacity building? And is capacity building an issue of financing or personnel or training, and who exactly should be involved? Very existential question.
you want to answer that? Oh,
Before then, I wanted to ask you this, something came to my mind as you were speaking, because it's not that we lack ideas or we lack, if you read some of these documents, they're very clear mechanisms. I don't know whether the issue is lack of political will. Where are we at when it comes to will? I was just thinking aloud. Oh, like, is there political will in general? Do people want to see, if there's peace, who benefits? And if there's no peace, who loses? And I'm just thinking aloud as you were talking.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I do agree. Can I add to that?
yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I do agree with Louis's observation. So it's not you did, I think you did also did mention about setting up a specific, which is quite a paradox. I don't know if you're the one that mentioned setting up a special um uh, body that deals with that and then talking about it. So I think again it's not about having all of this. We don't lack, we've got a plethora of bodies or mechanisms to deal with this. I agree with his lack of political will, and not just political will. We fail to look at the political economy of this conflict. It's one, DRC is one that is rich in minerals, so is one that is high in the political economy. Risk is very high. So there's a lot of people that will benefit from the conflict and the chaos in that place. So and with issues like this, there has to be a lot of ways you deal with it. It has to be a lot of negotiation. So there will be, in dealing with this. So in my own experience working with, for instance, with insurgents or studying insurgents which have been empowered. So when you do, there has to be some give and take, some kind of like negotiations. So with DRC, there has to be, there's a whole lot of interest from the regions, and there has to be some sort of give and take, some sort of yielding, some sort of compromise. So, but when we talk about capacity building as well, you ask a very salient questions. Whose capacity are we building? So are we talking about building the capacity of the military to carry out more militarized approach, or capacity of the civil society? So we need to be very clear as well, because we just use that word capacity building without being, very, very specific. Whose capacity and why are we building this capacity? What's the outcome of our consequence of that?
Thank you. Thank you. I think in our earlier discussion, we did discuss about one, we have a challenge in terms of DRC itself, in terms of institutions, governance institutions, from the police, security, police, we need to build capacity of that, of the justice system, of just institutions around governance, that so that the, and even the transportation, within logistics within the country itself, because you'll find that from, for example, from Goma to the capital, Kinshasa, is about 3 days to get there. And within that, if this is a country so big, right? It has to have the structures that it is one central country that is governed, that there is a governance system that works. Because you find that Eastern DRC is closer to the areas around it, the countries around it, as compared to it being closer to the capital. So not much. So that's where the capacity building comes in. But I think I'm talking too much. I'm your moderator. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to come back to the question of what can we learn from the peace processes, and it is a very, very important question. And indeed, I think it is urgent time to have this reflection on those past processes, and also acknowledge that actually the Sun City agreements, the Pretoria agreements, those that formally ended the Second Congo War. The question is, did they actually bring peace, or did they transform the conflict? And of course, there was basically a power sharing agreement that came out of it, whereby the belligerents were integrated into the government and army institutions. But soon, directly after, we have seen this rebellion of CNDP emerge, which was the forerunner of M23. So, and this dynamic has also been undermined by Kabila itself. And so I think we have to draw lessons from the past, and that is also one of the reasons that President Tshisekedi refuses to dialogue with M23, because it's also what he says. He says, I don't want to do any more mixage, brassage, which are the previous processes for demobilization and reintegration of belligerents. So the current refusal to dialogue is very much linked to these past experiences with peace process. And we also have to, I think we also um, have to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we are slowly going to, I'm going to give specific questions to each of the panelists so as to take our discussion forward. And we'll start with you, Dr. Michael Nwampa. Just on the conflict and development, and just to ask you, how does the militarization of conflict in the DRC impact long-term development goals? And what alternative approaches could be more effective? And perhaps you can draw out the situation in Nigeria of Boko Haram and the experience there, and how it can be applied to the DRC crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me start from Bram's last statement. And I want to start saying sometimes a non-militarized approach like dialogue does not necessarily guarantee lasting peace or better development than a militarized one. It can equally escalate, and prolong conflicts if wrongly applied. So, but nevertheless, a military or militarized response rarely brings durable peace, although it may offer some temporary relief, which is limited in any case. So, but what we see, unfortunately, is like the conflicting parties in the DRC have chosen a militarized response. We see with Rwanda through supporting the M23 rebels, and then we've also seen again here. We've also talked about sometimes the double standard. Also, DRC as well is also complicit in terms of working with several armed groups, particularly the FDLR. But each party seems to have some kind of legitimate grievances, which we shouldn't neglect, which I think has been neglected. So on the part of the DRC is right to fight for its sovereignty and territorial integrity. And because talk about Rwanda also has the national security fears for its national security, and also look at maybe Rwandese, Congolese, their human rights and also their rights in Congo. You did talk about exclusion, maybe excluded from governance or all of that. But again, like I've been saying, underlying all of these legitimate or valid claim is also the political economy, which chaos, conflict favors that. And we'll still talk about the multiple actors or participants, both regionally and externally that benefit from it, and the humanitarian crisis that it creates. But I think the alternative approach would be addressing these issues. So if we look in DRC, for instance, we talk about minings that are happening. People, like you talked about governance, we're talking about even citizens of Congolese that have been displaced from their land by Chinese miners. And you see these people may be forced into joining these armed groups. So alternative approach will be dealing with all of these issues. And then again, sometimes we hamper on humanitarian responses without also looking at under the banner of stabilization. We have MONUSCO, we have all of these processes rather than a diplomatic means. So stabilization for me is one that has over the years, if you look at interventions in the 90s or early 90s or 2000 compared to UN stabilization missions in current times, it is one that emboldens the elites in Africa, elites in these spaces, to continue without it disincentivizes them from dealing with these issues, because we just want to deal with security. We just want to deal with let's make it stable for now, temporary gain, without dealing with long-term gain. So, and this again doesn't really work. So until we start addressing, create structures where we then start addressing these issues, we'll also come back from 2012, 10 years, we've come back to Goma, still the same issue. So I think the alternative, we're nothing short of addressing these root causes and dealing, recognizing that Rwanda has, uh, um, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Recognizing
can.
that Rwanda has a legitimate claim as well as all of these claims, and then addressing these claims. But then again, if you look at the Great Lake region, there's a lot of parallels or similarities between the Great and what is happening in the Lake Chad region. So when we see in the Lake Chad with the Boko Haram, when it started, it was more seen as a Nigerian problem until it started attacking the neighboring countries. But then again, we look at the historical issues, which is also similar in the Great Lake. We see, like Fort Nigeria, for instance, had issue with Cameroon in the past. It had to do with Bakassi territory that they were fighting over, and then Nigeria had a war with Chad. So this kind of affected that kind of like coordination to fight this common enemy. But I think again, there's a bit of some difference as well. Whereas in the Great Lake, you see that each of these countries, see whether it be Uganda is fighting, more concerned about the AFD operating from Congo. Rwanda is fighting, all of these rebel groups that they feel to strengthen its own national security. But the commonality is just the quest for that mineral resources. So there's not been the opportunity to carve out a common enemy. So I think in the Great Lake, they've not been able to cover like what is the common enemy that we need to galvanize around and fight. So in Nigeria, what's happened when they set up the multinational joint task force? They were all operating separately and counterproductive, and Boko Haram was benefiting from this. So each one was just fighting for his national interest. But when it dawned on them that this was a regional problem that affected everyone, there was an improvement in it. So I think moving forward, if some of the lessons that could be learned from the Nigerian Lake Chad would be driving out or carving out a common problem that is common to Burundi, Uganda, Rwanda, and addressing and seeing it as that is when that regional approach can really work. And lastly, I think again, there's also a civilian component, which you have to about civil society. In Nigerian case, we saw the civil society kind of like rose up against like the people, the populace itself that felt threatened by the military as well as the insurgents. They set up like a vigilante group, and then they became integrated into the military components, and they were very useful. So when we talk about the rebels that have been integrated, maybe integrated into the government, that could also be a positive thing because they did play a big role in stemming the near daily attack that Boko Haram was doing because they understood the terrain very well. So they were able to be useful to the government forces in providing strategic intelligence and they were integrated. And now you see what's going on with the amnesty that is being given to them. So it could work if it's properly done. So I think these are some of the key points that I'm allowed to add to some of the parallels that we're saying.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's so important what you say on Boko Haram. I think coming together for a joint cause, and of course the integration of the rebels into the army, the military, provided strategic intelligence. I think that's so important. I'll go to Idil if she's on the line. I think we've lost her. She was to give a gender perspective, but perhaps as maybe before we conclude, we'll still talk on a gender perspective. But maybe I can ask Chido to to discuss on how effective are regional economic communities, i.e. like East Africa Community and SADC, right, in addressing conflicts. I think that's actually tackled it in a way. And what role can preventive diplomacy play in mitigating electoral violence and political instability in the Great Lakes region?
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think when it comes to preventive diplomacy, this is also for me a question of early warning. And the early warning structures, I think, on the continent are actually the most, have sort of traditionally been the most well-developed of the APSA structures, the Africa Peace and Security Architecture. The challenge has always been between early warning and early action. And so I feel that at the moment we are kind of past, sort of the early warning phase, because as I mentioned, what's happening in DRC today was pretty clear in December. But I feel like a component of preventive diplomacy that we sort of haven't really spoken much on is on grassroots community and civil society, and how we can sort of leverage, what is happening on the ground. Because in reality, as much as we, sort of talk about Rwanda and sort of the global interests, the dynamics at that level and the dynamics at community level tend to be a little bit different, because at community level, these communities are very capable of coexisting. So in as much as they then that coexistence gets sort of overtaken by the wider conflict dynamics. And this makes me I think, frustrated when I think of that in terms of the ICGLR, because the ICGLR had one of the most well-developed structures in terms of engaging with civil society and grassroots and those kind of networks. And in this situation, it would, because a big part of my research has been looking at how regional organizations can align with grassroots, grassroots movements. And the challenge, therefore, is because member state government are very suspicious of civil society in their own country. So what you'll find is a member state of SADC, let me take my country, Zimbabwe, is not really going to push for that type of alignment between civil society and regional organizations, because they worry about their own civil society in their own country. And so they wouldn't want to push it. But it is very, very important, because over and over in DRC, we've spoken about the lack of alignment between the Nairobi process, the Luanda process, and the military process. And then there's no conversation at all at what can be done at grassroots level. And yet, even when it comes to early warning, that is even the intelligence. It actually comes from communities. They are on the ground, and they see the tensions rise. I mean, a big sort of hit to the ICGLR was the 2015 crisis in Burundi, where Burundi could actually, the ICGLR had to even shift its headquarters. The head was sort of named persona non grata by the government, and there was no pushback from the member states. But I do think that it's important to re-look at the project that the ICGLR had in terms of having a network of civil society, because that is the backbone of preventive diplomacy. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's an important point. I want us to start wrapping up. I see that our time is coming to a close, but I just wanted to maybe talk about gender and peace building, because I see Idil is not here right now, who would have addressed this. But in terms of the DRC, how can what specific measures can be taken to protect women and girls in conflict zones? I think going back to the Great Lakes region, the pacts, there was a pact on sexual gender-based violence, And because it was recognized that after the genocide, after the two conflicts and the previous conflicts in the DRC, that there has been quite a lot of gender-based violence, sexual gender-based violence, and even in the current conflict as it is, the people who suffer most are children and women in conflict areas. So there is need for, I think, to work on the protocol. There are protocols that are there, but they are in the books now because this conflict is ongoing. But there should be humanitarian support for those who have experienced this, and also support, not just unsensitization, even before we get to the conflicts on sexual gender-based violence, so that we do not have a recurrence of the same time and time again, because it seems that that's what has been happening in these particular areas. So I know we've done a lot of work with ED and the UNIFEM and on that. But I think this is an important, very, very important as we go forward as far as this crisis is concerned. But because I know we are, in terms of time, I won't ask for more comments on this particular issue. So I would like to ask for if there are two or three, we'll take 2 or 3 questions before we wrap up. Bram, I know you, the first question should be addressed to you before you go. Yes, yes. So any questions? Oh my. We'll take, please make them very short. And yes, the first hand up, and please say your name and where you're coming from. Please go ahead. The first person, yes, I'm pointing at you. Please go ahead.
At the University of Nairobi. I'm also a part-time lecturer. Maybe if you allow me just to make a very brief comment and in regard to this particular subject. The paradox of the post-colonial African state has been a subject of debate among historians, intellectuals, and diplomats. This particular conflict has been discussed whether it's a conventional warfare or it is unconventional warfare, because it has different dynamics. But to mention one of the Nigerian scholars, W. Aladefawole, professor of foreign policy and international relations, in his book, The Illusion of the Post-Colonial State, Governance and Security Challenges in Africa, he argues that the post-colonial African state has experienced a lot of challenges, and it seems to allude that the conspiracy of the imperial conspiracy is responsible for the subversion of the post-colonial African state. I don't know whether that makes sense in this context, maybe because there are some internal dynamics. When you look at the DRC, there's some regional and of course also external factors that could be really alluded to this. But just to summarize in this particular subject, the UN Security Council resolution on 21st February this month, resolution 2773, that of course calls for stop of the hostilities and the pulling out of the Rwandan forces, sets the ground for the international community to move in. But then again, the question is that this is an indictment to the UN and multilateral diplomacy, and also African Union Charter as an instrument of good governance, because it's coming too late, and people feel like it's a problem that has persisted for too long. And just to sum it up, let me say that, is it also the problem of what we call resource curse, or the paradox of the plenty that DRC is facing? Or is it maybe an absent government in some of the regions? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other question? Any other comments? Yes, we'll take 4. Yes.
Hello, my name is Owen Bovia from the University of Nairobi. And my question is, during this conversation, we have focused on what at a regional and international level, what organizations can do, but we have not properly addressed what the Congolese themselves can do, because for lasting peace within Congo, the primary actors must be the Congolese and the Congolese government. I'll trace this to what I'd call a systematic failure within the Congolese government. For example, we see that one of the key issues has been the provenance of minerals, which can be traced from Congolese mines, but are exported from other countries within this Great Lakes region. So what capacity building efforts can be used to build the provenance, the tracing and provenance of minerals? Secondly, helping the Congolese security forces to be just, so that the other actors such as Rwanda cannot use the pretext of Tutsis, protecting Tutsis within Congo to benefit both economically and disrupt the peace in that region. And finally, what is the governance? What shift can there be in the governance of Congo? As has been correctly pointed out, Congo is such a large country, and since its independence, there has been increase. We can trace it back to the Katanga secession movement. What can be done so that Congo can actually have an effective governance systems that wards off the interest of foreign actors in DRC? Yeah.
Thank you. One more. Yes, one more.
Hello, my name is Jessica Damar. I work at ALN and I support ALN Academy. My question concerns the approach that has been taken so far with solving these dilemmas, and not only in DRC, but also across the region. I feel like there's a lack of Africanacity to the approach that is taken towards the resolution of these problems, because basically we usually talk about Pan-Africanism, we talk about Ubuntu, but when it comes to solving the problems that actually bedevil our people, then those concepts become, foreign. So my question would be, should there be an African approach or a Pan-African approach to solving problems that face Africans? And what would that look like? And what are the key challenges that we might face when we delve into that? And yeah, basically just interrogating that whole approach to mitigate those instances of false generosity being, given to these countries in the case of such humanitarian crisis from the West or other countries. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other question? There was a last one. There was a last hand up. Yes. Last hand up before your questions are quickly addressed.
Thank you. My name is Bichanga Jefferson. I'll keep my question very brief. We have touched on one of the reasons of the conflict being the failure of the government to uphold the 2012 agreement between them and M23. And so could we highlight something on that? And for example, what were some of the challenges of the agreement, and why couldn't the rebels be included in the army so as to try and solve the conflict? Thank you.
Thank you. I think I have our panelists ready, and yes, we start from left to right, but I will also ask Michael to chip in as we go. Dr. Michael Nampa. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so is this where we do the closing remarks?
Closing.
I
Yes.
just like out my closing statement, because then I can answer that question and then sort of close.
Yes.
I think on the African solutions, part of the problem is paying for African solutions. So even some of our mediation processes, think about the mediation in Sudan, they're not funded by African. They're not coming from the African Peace Fund. And even when you look at the deployment of regional forces, they were still being funded by the European Union. So that's a big challenge, is the challenge of funding. So as long as you're being externally funded, it's very difficult to shape a process around, sort of African solutions. So African solutions are being paid for by somebody else. And until African solutions can be paid for by Africans, then we'll see a different approach. But sort of very quickly to close on the question of gender, and also even touching on African solutions, we did a research where we were looking at, peace support operations and looking at the characteristics and seeing that which characteristics sort of are associated with stabilization dynamics. And what we found was that gender was a very strong component. The gender the gender distribution within peace support operations was a very strong force when it's associated with the member state, where these particular personnel in a peace support operations were coming from, and when it was also associated by whether they were military or non-military. And the results that we found out was when you have a strong gender component of people, of personnel who are coming from within the region and therefore speak the language, are able to speak the local language in a country, and are not armed troops, but are actually the civilian component of these forces, then you are most likely to get more periods of stabilization. And this is important, I think, in the question of how we go forward in terms of regional military intervention, how they must be comprised. And right now we're seeing a very strong military push, but I think we need to sort of step back again and go to that multidimensional, type of structure that we saw the UN peace support operations moving. When you look at Gambia, an intervention by the AU, they sent 10 people straight into the government. And that's something that it doesn't take a lot of money. And that is something that I think can be useful, where we look at how to use a fewer number of people, but place them very, very strategically within, the governance structures in a country of intervention. So that is my closing statement.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all these very interesting questions. The question on the post-colonial state, I'm going to respond to that also somewhat academically, because I think indeed we need to have this reflection on what the Congolese state actually is and how it relates itself to its dynamics of conflict. Because often we put the state against armed groups, or we put these things as juxtaposed to each other, while in reality on the terrain, those dynamics are very much intertwined with each other. And so we can have a very much broader historic background. I mean, I am Belgian, so let's go back to the colonial period, of course, and how the Congolese, how Congo as a state made for extraction was constructed. All these things, of course, play into this context. So I think we need to do that, but we also need to do that for other countries. And if we talk about state interests, we also have to look at how the Rwandan state is structured. And its response in the DRC, it's also very much linked to how the Rwandan state and nation has been constructed by colonialism, in post-colonial period, but also after the genocide. And the same goes for Burundi, and the same goes for Uganda and all these other actors that come into it. So I'm all for asking us these questions. On the resource curse itself, I think I'm not a big fan of the resource curse, to be honest, because it has been disproven by other countries, and it gives a lack of attention to the more political dynamics underlying it. Also, the link between minerals and armed conflict is not that straightforward. Neither. It's true that it sustains armed conflict. It has been shown. It also, in the case of the M23 rebellion, that is also the case. It controls a mining site. This brings revenue to the movement. These kind of economic activities have become militarized because of conflict. Those are all true, but they are not necessarily always the driving force of conflict. So conflict has various different drivers. On the Pan-African question, I mean, one part of the phrase is we talk about African solution, but we also have the African problems. And in which way is this an African problem? So there are these global connections, and of course there's also these broader principles of humanitarianism that, for example, I stand by. So I think the international community has a role to play in support of African solutions, if possible. And I think it can play I think it can do better on that. And on the last question on the previous agreement, well, M23 actually emerged out of unhappiness with the 2009 agreement that was signed on the 23rd of March 2009 with the CNDP. And a lot of it goes about the integration into the army, but also the question of amnesty. So for certain commanders, so there's a lot of individual interests involved in this. And one of the questions that we have to pose ourselves today is, in which way is this agenda of back to the peace agreement of 2009, still relevant in the current context because, as I mentioned, we have seen this escalation. The reality today is not the same as it was in 2021, nor as it was in 2013. So, but only opening up space for dialogue will allow them to, will force the group or whatever it is, its various factions to make its agenda more explicit. And then we'll see in which way it relates to the previous peace agreement.
Okay. For me, on the resource cost, just to affirm what he has said, even in Congo itself, the crisis is in the east, but other parts of Congo are doing Katanga, all these provinces are doing okay. So there's just, the problem is unique to the east. And I feel like there's need for possibly a paradigm shift, because at the crux of this problem is this. DRC feels that Rwanda enters Congo under false pretexts. The interest is the minerals, and that's why they're in Congo. This idea that they need a security buffer to protect them from threats that come from FDLR or the targeting of the Congolese Tutsi, they don't buy that story. And for Rwanda, they feel that they need to protect themselves. So we have to also check on the Rwanda side, are these threats of FDLR real or imagined, or have they dwindled over the years? Because the genocide happened in 1993. I think those in Interahamwe then must be very old. It's 30 years ago. Maybe they're new in Interahamwe, I don't know. But this issue of Rwanda's feeling a threat from FDLR or the targeting of Congolese Tutsi, we also have to interrogate it and be clear about where we're at. So I think there has to be a paradigm shift and either a convincing or appeasing on both sides, because both sides have stuck with that narrative, and that narrative is what drives this whole thing. This idea that DRC feels that Rwanda has infiltrated its army, its opposition, especially for Tshisekedi, he feels that Rwanda have also infiltrated the opposition groups and also the military. And so there's no loyalty towards Kinshasa within the military. And there are certain military generals who have loyalties to Kigali. So this whole issue has to be addressed. And then when it comes to the issue of African solutions to African problems, I feel like that is sometimes an escape for solving the problems, because just because you're African doesn't mean that you can solve African problems. I think if you look at in this conflict, we have the same family names. Tshisekedi, the current president, his father was a president. Kabila Jr., the father senior was there. Kagame has been there for 30 years. You have this, Museveni has been there. You have the same names, you have the same elites dealing with the same problems. And it becomes very, very difficult to bear pressure on people that you interact with, that are aligned with, that have been in power for so long. So I am not necessarily convinced about this idea of African solutions to African problems. I just find it's an escape, and it's just a bunch sometimes of cronies amongst presidents and elites who just shuffle us around. I think we need to find concrete solutions. They don't necessarily have to be African solutions.
Thank you. Dr. Michael?
Yes, I quite agree, and I just take from the last speaker was, well, let me start from the post-colonial state and respond to that. So in one of my last books, I was looking at the legacy of colonialism. I did touch on three legacies: the politics of politicization of ethnicity, and then we talk about the colonial legacy of violence and arbitrary creation of states. So we see that from when many African states gained independence from the 60s till now, we still see that the colonial legacies continue to have reverberating influence. But what's happened, again, from what Louis have just said, is we also need to see that the elite the problem in Africa is an elite problem. So we've seen that the elites have inherited those structures and legacies, and they've perfected those legacies. So what we're beginning to see, and what we also need to appreciate, is that those legacies, that there seems to be a teeming youth population that are becoming more politically conscious, more divorced from the anti-colonial or liberation parties. We see in Botswana what's happening in Botswana. We see what happened with ANC in South Africa. We see was going on in Mozambique. We saw even in Kenya. We saw the protests. So we see a youth population that is challenging those narratives. So what we're beginning to see is such a remover from that narrative, and people that are being conscious and looking at how to move the continent forward. And speaking about that as well, I'll tie that into the resource cost problem. I think, again, one of the things I think Africa should do is to de-emphasize resources, regardless of what we have. We're not the only continent that have resources, and begin to look. Africa has contributed very, very minimal to climate change. Africa needs to industrialize. So I think, again, Africa, and that's where the African solutions come. That's where Africa needs to emphasize its own. We need to industrialize. There needs to, in most parts of Africa, there's no electricity. So to be able to move away from that extraction, importing or exporting, extractive materials to manufacturing and all of that, you need to industrialize. So I think we can talk about resource costs without addressing that. So we're looking about the climate financing and then what Trump is doing as well with suspending USAID and aid could be, in a way, a blessing in disguise. It could help Africa to look inwards. But I think, by and large, when they say African solutions for African problem, I see it differently. I see it as an awakened, an enlightened populace, an educated populace that is looking at resources not in a myopic way, not looking at raw resources, but looking at the human resources, looking at Africa has the largest youth population, and that is a resource, and start looking at that in that sense. So this is how I see how we can move forward to begin to solve all of the issues in the continent. So we have to look away from raw materials, and then again, like the panelists have rightly mentioned, the last panelist, we can't expect change if we have the same actors in power. These are the same elites that have been in power. So those structures need to be removed. And I think when they say African solution, African problem, the way I see it is the African youth, the women, the women, the girls, the young girls in the that are coming up are the ones that are the solutions in themselves, and how they challenge these structures. And that's the only way we can. But Africa needs to also begin to leverage the power it has, because you see a lot of people caught in Africa. We see Russia, we see China, we see all of this. They're beginning to see the influence of Africa. But does Africa see the power it has? So that is what the problem is. We need to begin to see what power we have, and to then leverage on that to be able to make demands. And and I think one of the places has to be the climate change. We have to industrialize, and we didn't contribute a lot to climate change. So I don't see why we should bear the brunt of all of that. So that's what I can just contribute to the issue moving forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think yes, we are coming to a close of this a wonderful conversation. I think quite a number of ideas that have come up. Your questions have been fully answered, I can see. And just a short one to say that in spite of all we have said, we must also admit that, for the first time, we have a democratic, democratic in terms of there's a term limit in terms of the new government, the government in DRC, that for the first time there is a 10-year, Shekedi got into power in 2018, and I think it's 5 year he managed his first term, and he's on his second term, isn't it? Yes. So there is that, they have done something very, very important, that indeed the elections of 2018 brought in that change, right? That and then the constitution, they have a constitution that is for a 10-year limit. Although, of course, right now I hear there is a bit of challenge around that. But this is an important stage in terms of the governance structure of that country, because previously you've had term limits that are for quite a number of years. Each of them, I think, some for maybe 20 years or 10 years or more than 10 years. But this is, I think, is something to congratulate, to say that if this is promoted, then we can have a place where we can start seeing capacity building, government institutions that work, right? Being the way of life, right? About the issue of resource costs, I don't believe that there is such a word, because we have seen in the same Africa case studies like Botswana, where a small country able to manage its own resources, diamonds, and they are popular as well. And there is no war. So there is no curse. It's how you manage. So, but at the same time, even as we talk about the challenge in DRC, I like the point that was put across, the question, Congolese need to take up their destiny, right? In terms of one, should they negotiate? Should all of them sit down and negotiate? The need for dialogue, right? Because it has to be an inclusive government, right? Do they need to take a lead from Kenya, for example, right? We've had these open-ended government structures that work for purposes of peace, right? What kind of model should they have going forward? Because the idea is that, you're at a point where you either lose the whole or you can win the battle, but lose the war in itself, right? So it should be a win-win situation for everybody. And I think as the region, as international players, the issue is making sure that the country stands and the people stand, and the humanitarian challenges, the conflicts is brought to an end. So as we wrap up, I think we have left you with much more to resonate with, to discuss, to see how to move forward in what is indeed a conflict in our region. And it has to have an end date, termination date. It cannot be open-ended. So let's hope that the solutions that we do will not be open-ended solutions, but will bring to an end, a permanent end of this conflict. I thank you. I'm happy to have moderated this session. Thank you very much. Asanteni.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for
Thank you.
coming. We really appreciate it. Dr. Nkwampa, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you fly to Nairobi soon to visit us. But yeah, that brings us to the end of our webinar. And we just want to, show our appreciation to our speakers. Michael, I thought you were going to run away, so I'm very ready for you. And if we could maybe take a quick photo before you head out. But yeah, thank you all for showing up in person. We've got snacks and refreshments for you outside on the terrace. So you're welcome to socialize, network, and please keep in touch with us and let us know if you come up with any questions, and we're happy to answer those as we go. But yeah, you are all dismissed. And to the online audience, y'all can go as well. All right, bye.
Bye.